one way of building our sovereignty, it will be to set some standards rather than adopting them.
Welcome to Shielded, the last line of cyber defense by PQ Shield, the podcast where we are moving the conversation around post-quantum cryptography from the why to the how. I'm Jo Lintzen, your host, and I'm here to guide you through the challenges, innovations, and solutions that will help your organization stay secure in the quantum era. Let's future-proof your defenses together. Welcome to this episode of Shielded. I'm your host, Jo Lintzen, and today we're joined by Carolina Polito. She is a researcher in the Cybersecurity program at the Center for European Policy Studies, or CEPS for short, and a PhD candidate in international relations at Lewis University in Rome. Carolina works at the intersection of cybersecurity, digital governance, and geopolitics, contributing to the policy guidance for governments and the private sector on how to operationalize quantum readiness and ultimately strengthen cyber resilience. Carolina, welcome to Shielded.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the...
Oh, absolutely. It's our pleasure to have you here. So in our preparation, you told me that you're in the final phases of preparing for your PhD. So, of course, I'm sure all of your time is being spent on getting ready for that. So I'm curious, once that is done, what's the first thing you're going to spend your time on?
Well, I'm going to take a vacation after this 4 weeks of the summer, basically. But I guess in terms of the PhD, I've been focusing a little bit less on quantum, but a little bit more on biometric system. So probably the first things that will spark my interest, which is a little bit in between also what we address in our rapid quantum is the evolution of the digital wallet at the EU level. It's and of the entry at sea system. These are the two most important biometric projects that we have at the EU level. So following the evolution of those in terms of content, it's probably going to be what's in my pipeline after the PhD it's done.
So one short, quick vacation, and then back into this more of the same projects. That's great. Focusing on the digitalization of Europe. So obviously your work, you sit at an interesting intersection within pretty much cybersecurity, geopolitics, of course, a big topic at the moment, and governance in the broadest sense. So what drew you into that field? What piqued your interest to take down that road into your career?
Yeah. So I start my formation, let's say, it's in international relations and political science. So for my bachelor and master, I studied international relations. And then at a certain point, I started realizing, I think it was with the end of my master, oh, well, there is something that is really, impacting, and it's going to impact more and more how states interact and how we interact with the states as citizens. And these are technologies that are mediating all this, layers of relationship. And I guess the sort of realization that I got and that sort of drove both my research in the PhD and in the policy field is the fact that all this technological system, they're not just technical tools. They're never neutral in a sense. They're always shaped by society one way or another. And they also shape the institutions that make use of this system. No? They shape the boundaries of what institutions can do. The cognitive boundaries, or any other, type of boundaries of activities that are shaped of an institution that make use of certain technologies. So understanding what's, this deep connection between how we built these technologies and how these technologies sort of are impactful in what we then actually can do. It's sort of, my main interest, broadly speaking.
Oh, those influences flowing in the different directions. Yeah. And then of course, in your work and your research, you've worked pretty much across Europe, but also international. So I'm curious how that international perspective shaped your view on cybersecurity and then also digital sovereignty, which is another term that is being used quite frequently at the moment.
Well, I guess in terms of cybersecurity, the idea is that we are all on the same boat kind of thing. It's so the discussions in the end are, pretty similar, if you wish, in terms of cybersecurity, because um, I guess we all face the same vulnerabilities and the same problem, and we all face this, scenario which is filled with threats, which is hard to secure, in which the offensive has, like an advantage, and the defensive has to follow up on how to, um, how to do it. And so, yes, I guess it's like the first things that pops up in my mind is that the fact that we're all kind of facing the same, like issues. Even like internationally, when I worked for a brief period in South Korea, and they were very concerned about the North Korean threat, for example, and the sort of techniques that North Korean was employing for cyber attacks. It's a little bit the same discourses that you would find in Europe from other, malicious threat actors. I would say that in the latest evolution, of course, the more you have advancement, especially, in between, like nation states in the EU, the more the EU advances some discourses in cybersecurity, but also, for example, in the integration between AI and cybersecurity and whatever, that this creates a level playing field across Europe that allows to have discourses that are consistent, like in between member states. In a field such as quantum, I would say you would feel right now a more differentiation in the level of awareness or in the sort of national approach. Because again, there is not yet, I would say, this big overarching framework as we have, like in NIS2 for cybersecurity, or with the AI Act on AI, which creates this sort of common language and common, approach to also the discussion. Say.
Well, I think you raise an important point because you use the term awareness, right? And I think a lot of the work that you've put into things like the SEPS guidance that just came out recently is really a lot about awareness and creating that awareness and understanding. Now, within that guidance, I believe you've pretty much addressed challenges for the public sector, the private sector, but also defense. So I would like to know what the sort of the main goals were of that work, and how do you see the conversation shifting from inventory and risk assessment to hopefully now going forward 2026 and beyond, actually operationalizing this, quantum readiness.
Yeah, I think the idea of operationalization that you mentioned is really key in here, because also the report, I would say, as a name of like shifting from a discussion on awareness raising towards more, like, say, practical and how do we plan this transition? No, so in organization, a sort of workable logic towards this transition. The idea is a little bit, okay, we understand that there is an issue, and that so the main goal, of course, is to explain that quantum transition is urgent. And I think we can all agree on the fact that sooner or later we're gonna have a cryptographically relevant quantum computer. So again, we all know that we will have to transition at a certain point. And this is my happening even, like sooner than we expected. And this transition is going to be structurally complex. It's not something that is going to happen, like from day to night for organizations. So we need a sort of preparation and, again, a sort of workable logic to implement this transition over time. So we overview, like concept of crypto agility, like so you engage with suppliers, how do you build your inventories? We focus a lot on hybrid approaches, all these kind of things that are a bit slightly more practical, that just, like there is a problem, you need to understand you're exposed. Okay, you are exposed, but how do you actually then migrate? And I think overall, what the report is important in this sense is that it shows that this is not a cryptographic challenge, but it's an organizational challenge, it's a managerial challenge. Because again, a lot of things for organization will be, for example, identifying prioritization, like prioritizing the system that they will need to migrate is a managerial challenge. It's not, again, a cryptographic challenge, but also aligning, for example, the upgrades of the crypto with broader IT modernization cycles. No, you're modernizing, you're, like upgrading to a new, like IT systems. Why don't you also have, like your thought of including PQC in that modernization cycles? Again, this is also a managerial aspect, and most importantly, probably having program ownership on this. So you cannot leave these sort of managerial aspects to the IT department for organization. We need ownership within organization and sort of, yeah.
Across the organization, yeah. And I think your point on, rather than looking at it as this like one big giant enormous program, to break it down and add it to, smaller ongoing modernization programs. I think that's a great way to make it more approachable, even because organizations know quite well how to run those technology migration and upgrade programs, because they are constantly ongoing. They're planned. CFO has a budget for it. You brought up vendor readiness as well, and that of course brings us to take a look at the digital supply chain. Of course, a modern enterprise has a lot of cryptographic assets are in use that they don't necessarily can't influence directly. So I'm curious from your work, what you see on that aspect, and why it is so challenging for those organizations to understand that those cryptographic assets are part of the supply chain, and how to engage maybe with their vendor supply chain.
So I think one of the first challenge of, like cryptographic assets and understanding your cryptographic assets, you mentioned it yourself, is the fact that some of these are not, like fully in control for a certain organization, right? And it's hard to sort of, I think, a complete mapping of all of this supply dependency. You have all organizations rely on, like third-party software a lot, cloud services, external libraries. These are long chain of dependency. They are not always easy to talk. And the migration often stall precisely because there are these critical dependency points that are hard organizations. One issue, one problem in this is also that inventories are not, let's say, just technical scanning up. We cannot sort of have this idea of producing a complete scan of, like our cryptographic assets, because this would, on the one hand, giving a little bit of a false sense of, like security, because we have this idea of, we have, like everything mapped now. On the other hand, is also well being the teams with the sort of information that is not prioritized. So it doesn't matter that like every single crypto that you use in your organization. You need to know the cryptos that are important and that are critical for your organization. So all this sort of cryptographic assets needs to be prioritized in a certain way. So you need to combine this inventory with dependency mapping, first of all, but like critically dependency mapping, let's say. So how do you, again, prioritize, let's say, this asset?
And those dependencies can be, internal dependencies, but also external, where again,
Exactly.
you have your suppliers, customers, vendors that, might touch some of your critical data at some point. So yeah, I think mapping those dependencies is a great way of going about that. Now we often get asked, and I don't know, you might have a good answer or some thoughts around it. We often get asked, by procurement teams, like how can we even define what good looks like? Like, how do we know what to ask of our vendors? So can you share some thoughts, ideas to help answering that question, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this relates with the fact that this is also a market issue, in a sense. So the problem of vendors is the fact that right now we don't have a sort of market incentives for, like even like the different actors in this market, let's say, in being quantum ready in like there's not a comparative advantage right now to move early and to provide products that are quantum ready. So of course, if um, we have procurement teams that start asking for like quantum ready products, this will make quantum ready product also like more like more how do
A
you say, in the
competitive advantage. Yeah.
competitive, exactly, in the market. And so I would say a very first practical step is just updating the procurement guidelines and sort of so that like the vendors is sort of induced to disclose which cryptographic algorithm they're using, and like the protocols that they use in their products, whether they're quantum safe or not, whether they have a roadmap in place as vendors transition to post quantum. So really explicitly sort of structure the net. Again, what encryption you're using, where you're using them. How do you support hybrid models? So combination of like traditional crypto vehicles, quantum crypto. What's your timeline for the transition? What's your roadmap? These are all sort of practical questions. But if overall the idea is that start, like having a questionnaire in which when you're buying a product, you ask the vendors what is the level of readiness. And this will affect the market overall because it will make this product more competitive. And this will be in the market more, like quantum ready products because they will sell more.
Yeah. Others will notice and eventually also go down that path, right? And I believe there's a lot of this type of guidance in the work that you've done with SEPs on those guidelines. I think you mentioned when we spoke in preparation for the podcast, the idea or the thought to have some sort of a questionnaire and sort of a quantum readiness index. Is that something that you're proceeding that idea, or?
I mean, we suggest the fact that having a questionnaire would be something that it's valuable for companies. Again, in this sort of in their procurement cycle, it could be like ideal to structure really very much a questionnaire in which you have like a post quantum in mind. And I guess in the end, what probably you're looking for is a vendor that can shows that is aware of where its crypto hearts, that it's able to disclose what algorithms are used in its product, where again crypto sits in its stack, and it knows its own cryptographic dependency. Of course, again, these are chains of dependency. So also that you're like buying your product from, it will have its own dependency that is should be able to show, which this is a matter of visibility, like how are you able to sort of show me what is the product that you're selling me, what it's your product composed of. And then of course the second, I would say, element would be this idea of, like having a roadmap. Are you able as a vendor to, like provide me with some guidance on, like you have roadmap in mind? And probably more importantly, do you have a crypto agile attitude? Because in the end, I would say this might be not the last transition that we will have to face. So having, like systems that are able to adapt without having to rebuild everything from scratch, I think it's something, and so that they have, like their crypto agile, we can change, like this cryptographic more easily also in the future. I think this would be something that it really helps out, vendors in also positioning themselves in the market.
So really those 3 points more or less, right? As you engage with your vendor ecosystem, are they aware of it? Right. That's the first big one. Right. The second one is like, yeah, like you rightfully pointed out, do they have a plan? Do they have a roadmap? Right. It's like, where is this going to be developed into? And then the third one is really the agility aspect of acknowledging that
future.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This is not going to be a one-off migration, and then we're going to have another 50 year of stable cryptography use. It's going to look quite different. Now you did mention that it's good to think about the migration as a not just one big thing. Break it down into various steps. And then you also mentioned protocols and what protocols are being used, and so I think in this transition, um, you've coined the term of identifying high value, no regret use cases as a start to that journey. So is there anything that you can think of that are really the low hanging fruits, no regret, easy to do, first initial steps?
Yeah, I would say that again in here probably the main point that we were putting forward in the report is really this idea of like you can not aim at a complete mapping of your crypto. So you need to have this sort of prioritization idea, and so I would say the level of prioritization probably looks at what is high value, what is highly exposed, it would have a long life, and it's harder to retrofit. So, I mean, particularly long-lived sensitive data, critical communication, like central trust anchors or infrastructure that, like are very difficult to replace later. These kind of things that, again, if broken, so if the harvest now the later whatever principle, it's something that again you don't want regrets not adding, like transition, which means again also your inventories needs to be prioritized and your mapping needs to be prioritized according a little bit to this principle. What is that is high value, high exposure, long live, and like harder to retrofit probably in the future. So again, this will allow you, I would say, to build inventories that are really, like migration relevant, and tied to sort of concrete business processes and sort of migration strategy, yeah? And assets that are again prioritized.
Well, I'm always surprised on how basic even an initial step can be to say look at the TLS versions that are being used within your environments, and make sure that even that more of a flip of a switch migration to 1.3 will help set the foundation to even enable your systems to migrate towards quantum safety.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be, like you said, it doesn't have to be this huge big bang step. It can be, quite simple baby steps to lay the foundational work for this.
Migrations will help you to sort of understand also, like all these different aspects within your organization. So, like the certification, the application, so these aspects that, like by, like simply migrating even with, like TLS, this would help you out then understanding also your own organization for, like this bigger transition that will have to come.
So part of the work that you've done for the report also talks a little bit about how to benchmark quantum readiness across the industries in Europe and beyond. And I think there's a little bit of a call to action for public-private collaboration as well, including the idea of an oversight role for the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, or ENISA for short. Um, how do you see this helping with benchmarking and getting a good 30,000 foot view of where even are we at the moment, right? Where how much of this migration has even started?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, again, this idea is just at least providing, like observatory that helps us understand where we at right now, and where we at in Europe, where is the transition proceeding, who's doing what, let's say. So of course, like this idea of an observatory, it could have a little bit three functions. On the one hand, it could provide this type of benchmark saying, like who has already inventories, who is piloting solution, who has procurement standards in place that can, be, so again, where we are basically who's still at the awareness stage instead and probably needs to, speed up its process. So also give indication of, look, you're a little bit, late in this process. Look at where the others are. And also reduce a little bit the duplication efforts because it can help, sharing best practices if you're still in the awareness stage and there is other country that another level. I mean, there is a framework to share again. And also, sharing information between vendors, organizations, and regulators, which, in the end, of course, again, it's an observatory. So it would support the reiteration of interaction. So it's a really, really basic game theory. If we reiterate our interaction, then our coordination, it's better. And we should be able to proceed at more, consistent and coordinated way.
And, talking about the European initiatives and programs, and you did mention that in your introduction as well. A lot of work, of course, is being put into the European digital wallet and, standards like EIDAS 2.0. And you've called out that, there's a little bit of a lack of post-quantum requirements readiness in there yet. Why is that a missed opportunity maybe? And are there any risks associated with it for longer term security of those initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you have a product that it's being, introduced in the European market, and it doesn't have a mandatory provision for having, a B2C algorithm in it. A post-quantum cryptography does not mandate, let's say, post-quantum cryptography. Of course, it requires protection of, key and personal data to, state-of-the-art technology, which means that, look, a few wallet might, introduce the key, but, there is at the time to the possibility of, wallet being introduced in the market that will stay in the market hopefully well into, 2030. And they're not going to be, quantum ready from the start. It means they will need to be maybe retrofitted later, and this would be more costly, right? And also, harder to do. So I think our is, of course, in digital wallets, you then also have, trade-off with privacy for, this algorithm. So it's extremely easy right now. But I guess our sort of approach is even, broader in terms of, introducing new products in the European Union, being, wallets or whatever other digital products we're introducing. There should be sort of a bit more, not awareness, but, attention into, a crypto agility and crypto agile interfaces that could be even, I don't know if we have to mandate them, but sort of, pushed a bit, hard. And also, we could have a bit more, guided pilot deployments of this also for, PQC, digital wallets that are, therefore quantum ready. We could, have piloting exercises for, the deployment of these products across,
Even looking at performance and these type of
right.
things.
So we started testing how this would look like, even though it's hard and there are trade-offs, but then, especially because there are trade-offs, let's test them and let's piloting them and let's see. And of course, if this is regulated, through, the regulation itself, the directive itself, then it's easier to then put it into practice.
Put it into production in the end, yeah. Once you've tested all the kinks and the quirks, yeah. So one of the recurring themes, of course, in your research is digital sovereignty. And how would you see, quantum safe technologies fitting into a sovereign supply chain for Europe? How should Europe approach this?
Of course, there are, different aspects to this. And there is, the industrial preparation overall. There is the fact that you should, reduce reliance on non-EU suppliers for, critical sectors. In the defense sectors, we talk a lot about this. I think the most important aspect, probably from my sociological point of view, is also that the standard setting aspects. And we know that standards is something that it's always negotiated, but very, human and societal level. And it's a good, like place where, like power struggle can be observed, I would say, standard setting bodies. And, and you're seeing, like standardization in quantum, which is, like this incoming field, let's say, of, like new standards being produced in which we have, like incredibly talented European researchers, but not, like very much European standards yet. The They're being, like more pushed forward are the standards coming from the US. Um, so I would, like say that one way of building our sovereignty, it would be to start, set some standards rather than adopting them. Through our also own standardization bodies proceed in this direction. Of course, they're doing, like great job, and, like all European bodies on standardization are also proceeding, but we should be also, again, a little bit more um, incisive, I would say, when you manage.
Insist more on the yeah.
And I would say, because I think one of the issues the fact that, for example, in Europe, we don't even have a positive list of algorithm to be prioritized. This is something from which we could start, for example. So we had, like criteria to define what is, like completely safe and what is completely unsafe, but we don't have a list of what organization should actually implement. So let's start from this. Even, like in our standardization bodies and things like that, create guidelines on, like lists of algorithms that, like as Europeans consider that we want to apply in Europe. This is already something that we can control, then whatever, that we regard as.
Of course, there's a lot of guidance coming out of several member countries. France, Netherlands, Germany, with guidance and guidelines on which algorithms to use and how much or how little to adapt the global standard that is pretty much set by the US and NIST. So you've looked closely at the migration efforts in those countries. Are there a few lessons that we've learned that you can share and looking at those approaches?
Yeah, I would say the nice things was probably to show the variety of approaches, because in the end, like it as its own kind of, like personal strategy to proceed with this, but each and every one of this provides some, best practices that, like others could apply. So of course, in Germany, you have a bit more of, like strong centralized institutional coordination with, like PSI having a certain role, with, like that ecosystems. Whereas France is, it has very strong political commitment, like, and again, there also the ANC as, like a good role, and there is really, like there are also, like state-backed pilots. So this, like shows a little bit this strategic investment strategy. Again, a little bit more centralized, whereas in Netherlands, you have a bit more of a flexible, ecosystem driven, like approach to the transition with a lot of, like innovation apps involved, and this kind of, and you can approach this a little bit as, like considering what are your strengths as a country, and take like different, like best practices from the different examples that there are. So overall, I guess that the idea is that there is not one, like single road to approach the transition. But on the other hand, even though we have all these, like positive examples in Europe, we also can see that the issue is not, like solving in either of these cases. No, so the road is still long, also for all of these countries.
Yeah. It's the challenge, but it's also the strength of Europe, right? To being able to combine all those different approaches into hopefully one overarching guideline and strategy. So within all of this, the country's approaches rolling up into a European approach. What do you think? What would you call out as the single biggest policy challenge in achieving this perceived quantum readiness throughout Europe? Is there one thing in particular you'd call out?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, you mentioned a little bit yourself in the Western is the coordination. And you have to, you need to have all these steps necessary to, like having a transition, which is, like synchronizing standards, procurement cycles, certification, sectoral readiness, and, like all these national roadmaps. And within Europe, we kind of need to be, like coordinated in this. Otherwise, like if the weakest spot is just, like the weakest painful point, and then, like it goes along the full supply chain, as in cyber issue in general. And like in this aspect, the point is also to understand the fact that they will not, they cannot be one step after another. We cannot wait to have, like the standard in place to then, like starting thinking about, okay, so what's the procurement after now that we know these standards? And then I'm like, okay, so what are the national roadmaps? And proceed one step after the other. We need to proceed in parallel with all these different
Needs
tasks.
to be parallel work streams. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. We need polarization of this, which is also going to be a challenge, but it's something that it's necessary for really approaching this transition in a way.
So if an organization, would take only one action within the next 6 months or so, to take that first step towards quantum safety and better cyber resilience, what should that first thing be? Just one. Name just one thing.
Assign the responsible person for this sort of thing, and do not think that your IT department would be able to manage this. If your organization, assign a responsibility. Getting, as we mentioned, it's a management challenge. It's not very much a cryptographic challenge. It is also a cryptographic challenge, but it's much more a management challenge within organization. So I think who's responsible within your organization for this, assign responsibility to that person and start downstream from that.
And then allow them to build that cross-functional team that is going to be needed to put all this into. Great. Well, Carolina, thank you very much for joining today and for sharing your expertise and insights. Of course, I'm also curious to hear where the vacation is going to go to once you're done with your PhD. So that's probably an update that we're all interested in hearing. And then if our listeners want to follow your work, what's the best place to sort of follow the latest?
LinkedIn, or as an academic, I would say Scholar, effect publications. But this is like a slower process of publication. Otherwise, or like normal updates, LinkedIn, Carolina Polito, it's fine.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much again for joining, Carolina.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was really a pleasure and really fun.
Fantastic. And as always, to our listeners, thanks for dialing in. Don't forget to like, share, and follow our podcast so you don't miss an episode in the future. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay shielded. Until next time. Thanks, Carolina. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. The quantum era is already here. With the right tools, the right knowledge, and the right mindset, together we can face it head on. To find out more about PQ Shield and how our cutting-edge solutions can help you secure your data against the quantum threat, visit pqshield.com. Make sure to search for Shielded, the last line of cyber defense, in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Don't forget to click subscribe so you never miss an episode. On behalf of the team here at PQ Shield, thanks for listening.